Welcome, everybody, to our last session of the second day of the Ethics in Publishing Conference. And I hope you will join us tomorrow as well. I'm very glad to introduce my friend and colleague, Bill Kasdorf, principal of Kasdorf and Associates. Bill and I have known each other for quite a while, and I really admire the work that he does. Bill, as I mentioned, is principal of Kasdorf and Associates, a consultancy focused on editorial and production workflows, XML, HTML, EPUB modeling, information infrastructure, standards, best practices, alignments, and accessibility. He's founding partners of Publishing Technology Partners. He's active in the W3C, Global Publishing Evangelist, and serving on the Publishing Working Group, Publishing EPUB-3 Community Group, and co-chairs NISO's Video and Audio Metadata Guidelines Working Group. He's past president of the Society of Scholarly Publishing, member of the Book Industry Study Group, BISG, and serves on their Workflow Committee, the International Press Telecommunications Council, and the DAISY Consortium for Accessibility. He's the recipient of the SSP Distinguished Service Awards, the BISG Industry Champion Awards, and the IDEA Alliance Dear Luminaire Award. Bill has written and spoken widely on publishing technology and workflows and accessibility. He's general editor of the Columbia Guide to Digital Publishing, co-editor of the BISG Guide to Accessible Publishing, and serves on the editorial board of Learned Publishing, having guest edited the January 2019 issue devoted to accessibility. In his consulting practice, he has served large international publishers such as Pearson, Cengage, Wolters Kluwer, Kaplan, and Sage, scholarly presses and societies such as NEGM, the National Academies Press, Harvard, MIT, Toronto, Taylor and Francis, Cambridge, IEEE, the American College of Physicians, and the Cochrane Library. Aggregators such as VitalSource and global publishing and library organizations such as the World Bank, the British Library, the Asian Development Bank, OCLC, ORCID, and the Publishing Office of the European Union. Bill, it's great to have you here for the Ethics in Publishing Conference.
Great. I'm delighted to be here, John. Thank you for inviting me. Okay, folks, my assigned role here today is to talk about the state of accessibility, the past, the present, and the future. And so, logically enough, I'll start with the past. This is how publishers have typically viewed accessibility, namely, oh my God, do I really have to deal with this? I've got so much I'm dealing with. I don't really want to deal with this. I know it's important. I just can't deal with it. It's too hard. Well, it's not too hard anymore. Main message I want to convey today. Or it's too expensive. Well, it doesn't have to be that expensive anymore either. Or, well, how many people really need this? It's just a tiny fraction of the population, right? Well, I will take a little sidebar here to quote my friend Michael Johnson from Benetech, who I will dutifully and being a scholarly guy, cite as the origin of redheads and lefties. There are more blind people than people with red hair. And there are more dyslexic people than left-handed people. This is not an edge case. This is not something that is relevant to only a tiny fraction of the population. There are 10 times as many dyslexic people as blind people. There are 10 times as many low vision people as blind people. We're talking about lots and lots and lots of people are affected by or need accessible publications. And so, okay, I realize it's important to do this, but I just really don't know how to start. Well, most publishers don't realize that they're already probably started without being aware. And then the other final excuse is we just don't have the time or the bandwidth. We just can't deal with this. And the key there is it's not all your job. It's a collaborative effort to get this right. It did used to be harder. I absolutely need to acknowledge that. And since we're still talking about the past, and I've often been accused over the years of making it sound like it's easier than it really is. But really, in the not too distant past, it required special file formats. You probably have heard of the DAISY format, most commonly a synchronized text and audio file, but there's more to it than that, or an NCX file, which is a very specialized navigational file that was needed by assistive technology. You needed to use special markup that hardly any publishers actually knew anything about. DAISY had their own XML format called DTBook, which was designed for assistive technology to be able to interpret a publication marked up in that flavor of XML. But hardly anybody even knew about that, let alone knew how to do it. NIMAS is actually, you can think of it as kind of a subset of DTBook. It is used today primarily in K through 12 education, but again, it requires special service bureaus, et cetera, to use this. To do that, publishers typically don't do that themselves. SMILE is a very complicated XML format for synchronizing text and audio. Excuse me, I need to turn my phone off so it doesn't ring while I'm talking. And of course, special expertise, which sadly enough is still the case. Specialized accessibility service bureaus. I'm not trying to put anybody out of business. Those people just do wonderful work. Almost every college or university has what's called a DSO, which is a Disability Services Office. And again, those people are heroes, the kind of work they do to get a standard book or journal article in whatever form they can scrounge and turn it into something that's accessible for a student that needs it. They, believe it or not, they will sometimes have to go to the college bookstore, buy a print book, chop the spine off the book, scan it, and OCR it, and then try to put some structure into it so the student can deal with that book. And that's just tragic in this day and age because it started out as a digital file in the first place. Every book published today is a digital file except for hobby, letterpress hobby printing. But and of course in the past most publishers, were unaware of these things or had no way to address them. But it really is a lot easier now. So if it's so easy now, why isn't everybody doing it? Well, first thing I want to tell you is some publishers actually are doing it. But the reason it's so much easier is that it's now based on web standards, which are virtually universally understood and used rather than these very specialized formats and file formats and markup formats, et cetera. Almost all accessibility for publications now, or the web, of course, websites or publications are based on what's called the Open Web Platform. It's a constellation of standards, most of which are governed by the W3C, which I'm involved with, and some other related organizations. But you use it every day, I guarantee. In that constellation of standards and specs, the two fundamental things for accessibility are called WCAG and WAI-ARIA. WCAG is Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and that's really the foundation for accessibility worldwide. And WAI-ARIA, which I'll get into a little more in a minute, provides semantics in publication content or websites for assistive technology to use. And almost all accessibility standards and guidelines and requirements throughout the world have converged on WCAG as the foundation. So you've probably heard of Section 508, which is the U.S. The standard for accessibility for U.S. government publications and widely used outside of government publications. It was refreshed. It was the technical term, believe it or not, it was refreshed a couple of years ago. So it now aligns with WCAG as well. the EU specifications and other international specifications all have the same fundamental foundation, and it's something that publishers and technology system providers know about and understand how to use. And same with the file formats. I mentioned that, the DAISY Consortium, which is, again, a fantastic organization, does just wonderful work. And it's a global organization, really all areas of the globe. Well, maybe not Antarctica, but they are everywhere. And they used to have these specialized formats that they promoted to get, a standard for accessibility globally. And a few years ago, they switched to saying that EPUB-3 is the proper format for interchange of accessible publications. And of course, EPUB-3 is the standard for ebooks. Even, in case you don't know this, even Amazon. Yes, Amazon has a proprietary format that they actually deliver to Kindles, but the format that they want you to submit your files in to Amazon is EPUB-3. And since they get bashed a lot, I will tell you that Amazon is doing some good work on accessibility. So, and then EPUB-3 itself is based on the Open Web Platform. So it's based on standard HTML, XML, CSS, JavaScript, et cetera. Those and many others are the kind of fundamental building blocks of the Open Web Platform. And that's what EPUB-3 is based on. And it's standard EPUB-3. It's not some special accessible version of EPUB-3. Ideally, it's the same EPUB everybody can buy. That's the goal. And it's using markup that publishers use all the time, and that their vendors who actually produce most of the EPUBs, not the publishers themselves. Small publishers often produce their own EPUBs, but most EPUBs in the world are produced by vendors. Most vendors know how to use that markup and know how to make a proper EPUB. It's got HTML5 as the structural semantic foundation. So that basically says what all the components are. WAI-ARIA, there are actually two flavors of ARIA that I mentioned a minute ago. These two things augment the native semantics in HTML, like what's a section, what's an aside, et cetera, and gives it more specificity for the use of, to make it more useful for assistive technology and for accessibility. And WAI-ARIA is used across the web, and DPUB-ARIA is further ARIA markup that it adds publication-specific terms. So a section, for example, it's useful for a user to know that a section is a chapter. There are also sections inside chapters, but this particular section is a chapter. That's useful to know. So doc chapter is how you express that. And I mentioned an aside as a HTML structure. Doc footnote will say this particular aside is a footnote. So, so if you make your EPUB-3s well, oftentimes the only thing missing are image descriptions. I'll get back to that in a minute, but I want to walk you through several sectors of publishing to just give you a sense of where they are with regard to accessibility. And I know this event, and I know the GW program covers all sectors of publishing. Trade books are actually the easiest to get accessible. Many of them are without knowing it. The basics are, as I've been stressing, proper HTML5 markup and a good, clear reading order. Putting the headings in the right order. I'm going to get back to that in a minute. That's HTML markup, H1 through H6. Having proper navigation, a navigation file that says what order everything comes in and allows a user to jump. For example, you could skip to chapter 5, or you could skip to a particular section if that's what you want to read, just like a sighted person can do. And of course, that's a big part of that is a well-structured table of contents that has not just the chapter level titles, but section titles as well, so that a user can can easily navigate directly to a place in a book or another publication where they want to read. And of course, having links. And then I mentioned image description for meaningful images. One thing that the usual advice is all images have to have alt text. Technically, that's true because what's called the image tag in HTML IMG has to have an attribute called alt. So most images produced by vendors will have alt text, but almost always the alt text is useless. Lots of bad practices. One is called the no alt, which is to alt equals quote, quote, and no content to the alt text. Sometimes vendors will put the file name or the path to the image file in there. Oh my God, imagine this user using, say, a screen reader, which is reading this to them, right? They're listening to this. They don't want to hear the path or the file name. That is completely useless to them. They want to know why that image is in the book. The distinction I'm getting to here is that that people often don't realize is that what are called decorative images actually shouldn't have alt text. They instead get a role attribute called presentation, which assistive technology then knows, oh, this is just a decorative image. It's not conveying meaningful content. That's the distinction. If the image is something that's conveying something meaningful that the reader should know, then it should have alt text. But if it's just decorative, then it should not be described. And then the final point, which I was kind of inching toward a little bit earlier, is that the markup has to be based on the structure. Now, you might think that's kind of obvious, which it is, but I do lots of accessibility reviews for publishers, websites, and books and journals. And I guarantee you, always I find headings being used for presentation, the selection of the heading level to be based on what the thing's supposed to look like. So in other words, they've got, say, I'll find an H4 right after an H2 because they want it to be smaller, like an H4. They want it to look like an H4. Or there will be an H5, and then there will be another H4 without getting out of well, you can see what I'm getting at, is a completely muddled structure. It's supposed to be a hierarchical structure where the H1 contains an H2, and H2 is contained by an H1. It's a structural indication. And then you use what's called a class attribute to say, okay, this particular H2 is this kind of thing, and my CSS says what it's supposed to look like. That's probably the most common markup problem I find when I do an accessibility review. And it's not that hard to get it right. So anyway, for trade books, and again, my little footnotes points out that I'm talking about fiction and nonfiction books. Obviously, complicated books like cookbooks and children's books, many of which are fixed layout books with all kinds of layout issues, et cetera. Those are more complicated. I don't want to make it sound like those are a piece of cake. But for standard fiction and nonfiction trade books, it's really easy to get them accessible, particularly if there aren't any images. At the other end of the scale, education is actually the hardest, even harder than scholarly, which might surprise you in STM. But it's also the farthest along in getting it right. So the issues for education, one thing that's in effect, making this happen is that there are governmental mandates that schools and universities have to provide an accessible version of learning materials to a student who needs them. And that's why all those colleges and universities have those DSOs that make that what's called remediate a standard publication to make it accessible for a student that needs it. And interestingly enough, the publishers aren't mandated, it's the colleges and universities that are. But what's happening is that pressure is getting put on publishers to provide accessible content in the first place. And it's starting to actually be written into procurement rules. And so you're going to see that increasingly, that a school system or a university or faculty or faculty will not be allowed to require a book if a comparable book, if a book that is not available in an accessible version, if there's a comparable one that is. And the other thing for education is it's just darn complicated. Picture a physics textbook or a high school calculus textbook, et cetera. Or even a K through a primary school book that's full of images and all kinds of things going on. Those things are really complicated. So it's really challenging to get that kind of rich, complex content, either technically complex or graphically complex, to get it right. It's a lot of work, but those publishers are actually doing it. Particularly for higher ed, one of the main advantages is that they've shifted to really focusing on digital rather than print. And my slide here says platform focused. I should also clarify that that includes EPUBs. So for example, a platform like VitalSource or RedShelf that distribute lots of books to a lot of colleges. Students in colleges get a lot of books from VitalSource and RedShelf. They provide various formats, but they prioritize EPUBs. And of course, the platforms and the EPUBs, as I mentioned before, are all based on standard web technology, standard HTML and CSS, et cetera. So just that change in focus on the part of the publisher is kind of having as a side effect, making their content a lot more accessible or a lot easier to be made accessible than when they were purely print focused. And then finally, the vendors that they use to create these books and journals, et cetera, or do conversion to create EPUBs, even if it's post-publication conversion to EPUBs, a lot of the vendors have developed accessibility expertise. So frankly, it's often the case, this wasn't the case just a few years ago, but it's often the case now where at least for some of the leading prepress and conversion vendors, they actually know better than the publishers do how to get the publications. The reason I say it wasn't true a few years ago is that particularly the higher ed publishers spent unbelievable amounts of time a few years ago really teaching their vendors how to get it right. One of the big success stories is Macmillan Learning, which won the ABC Accessible Books Consortium Accessibility Award last year. I've been on the jury for that for the past, I can't remember how many years, but several. And they were recognized because they have made a commitment that all of the new editions of all of their books starting last year are all built to be accessible. They're EPUBs and they're with proper accessibility features. Well, the thing that, I'm a consultant, which means I deal with a lot of these vendors and I advise publishers on how to deal with their vendors or what vendors to use, et cetera. And I can tell you that what Macmillan Learning and Pearson and McGraw-Hill and Cengage, the big higher ed publishers have done the industry a real favor because they work like crazy to get their vendors to get it right. And they've partnered with accessibility experts to make sure that their internal staffs understand accessibility, et cetera. So kudos to them. And I'll also mention, because I'm kind of skipped over trade with that, for that respect, one of the winners the previous year was Hachette Livre in France. Same thing there. Now they're publishing trade books, but they built it into their specifications that their vendors had to produce properly accessible EPUBs, or they wouldn't get the work. And so there's now a huge I maybe shouldn't say huge, but there are a lot of vendors internationally that, thanks to Hachette, now know how to do EPUB properly because Hachette made them do it. So anyway, good for them. So I mentioned scholarly before, and it might surprise you that that's actually not as hard as the educational content. And there's a reason for that. So no, they don't typically think in terms of HTML. Scholarly publishing, for those of you that are scholarly publishers, this should sound familiar to you. There's an XML format that is absolutely the lingua franca of scholarly publishing, and it's called JATS or BITS. JATS is the journal side of it, BITS is the book side of it. It's basically identical, except for certain aspects, mostly in the metadata. But almost all scholarly content and the hosting platforms that host scholarly content all are based on JATS and BITS XML. But the thing is that XML is extremely highly evolved, very granular, very detailed. So all the structure that you need for accessibility is typically already there. And it's just a matter of an automated conversion to create an HTML version for your EPUB or your website. There's more to it than just the XML conversion, but that's a big fundamental part is getting the markup. And the point is that you're not starting over on the markup. You've already got all the structure. You're just using different tags for it. Math in scholarly content most commonly uses MathML, which is the XML standard. It's, again, part of the Open Web Platform. It's a W3C standard. It's actually currently undergoing what's called a refresh. It's been done in a W3C community group, and a lot of progress has been made for a next generation of MathML. And in fact, the wheels are turning right now to create a working group, which is the organization within the W3C that actually publishes a formal standard, which are called recommendations. So it's called putting it on a rec track, if you want, W3C lingo. And so a future version of MathML, which is going to be more optimized for easier presentation. It's going to have two flavors, basically, kind of a fundamental flavor that makes it much easier to get the presentation right, which is often the problem with MathML right now. And that's the reason why publishers typically today are not putting MathML in their EPUBs, because the EPUB rendering system, the reading systems, don't render it properly. But that's about to change too. I will just say, stay tuned on that. We are getting very close to the reading systems actually becoming able to reliably render the MathML. But anyway, the point is that the MathML is already there in the workflow for scholarly, scientific and mathematical books and journals for the most part. Certain disciplines that are LaTeX oriented are an exception, but lots and lots of math is done in MathML. And the same for tables. There used to be a model called Cal's table model that was predominant in scholarly publishing. Now even JATS and BITS recommend HTML tables is how you should be tagging your tables. And of course, HTML is what assistive technology is programmed to use. HTML tables are what are intelligible tables to a screen reader. And what about those pesky image descriptions? Well, I don't make this recommendation to all kinds of publishing, but for scholarly publishing, I strongly advocate that the authors should provide the starter image descriptions. And the reason for that is that they know why that image is in that book or journal article. It's not just a picture of something, it's trying to convey some information, and the author knows what it's there to convey. It is also true that it's useful for the publisher to have expertise on what is a good image description for assistive technology purposes. But frankly, that's a matter of copy editing. So you copy edit the manuscripts, you can copy edit the image descriptions. Just because the authors don't know how to do a perfect image description doesn't mean they shouldn't give you a draft of the content to start with.
Bill,
and it is really not rocket science. Yep.
Bill, I'm sorry to interrupt. Your video seems to have gotten frozen, so try refreshing your page. If you're using a Mac, do Command R, and if it's a PC, do Control R. It'll kick you out just for a sec, but then you can log back in. Apologies to the audience. We seem to have lost Bill's video for a minute. We'll proceed in just a sec. And thanks for submitting your questions. We'll get to those in just a moment. Okay.
That got me out of your system, but I'm back. Are you seeing? Yeah, I'm not seeing the slide now.
Just go back to the slides tab.
Oh, I got it. Yeah.
And then you're still where you were.
Good.
Apologies to the audience. We're still going, and then we'll get to your questions in just a moment.
So had people seen this slide or not?
Just start where you left off.
Yeah, well, I was talking about scholarly publishing, and I was almost done. Oh, no, I wasn't. I had finished this. Sorry. I'm back on track now. I just finished talking about the image descriptions for authors. Another thing that's an advantage for scholarly publishing is they are experts in metadata. And accessibility, metadata is an important thing with regard to accessibility, and it's often lacking in books and journals, in books particularly, in trade books particularly. But again, it's not a rocket science for scholarly publishers because they handle lots of rich metadata already. And again, their vendors, their prepress and conversion vendors, increasingly know how to get accessibility right. So here's some tools and services that you should know about. Basically, by the way, I've got a slide at the end of my presentation that gives you links to all of these. And I think John can confirm that the slides will be available to you later. I don't think they will. You can't link to them through this presentation, but if you get the presentation, if you don't get it, you can email me and I will email you my PDF, which has them all as live links. An important tool that was developed within the last couple of years and really is in wide use now is called ACE by DAISY. And this is a automated tool provided by the DAISY Consortium to automatically analyze EPUBs and report how accessible it is. It's not a rating. It gives you a very long, detailed report of there are these issues, this stuff you got right, these are things that you need to improve, et cetera. And it's extremely useful. So most vendors use this now. A lot of publishers use it to check the EPUBs that they get from their vendors to make sure that they've got them right, et cetera. However, an automated tool can only go so far in telling you whether your accessibility is good. So for example, to pick up on something that I said earlier, it can tell if that alt attribute is present in your HTML, your image element in your HTML, but it can't tell whether the description is actually any good. So if it's a file name, it doesn't know that. It just can say, good, you've got alt text. Well, you may have useless alt text. So they also have another service called SMART, which helps facilitate a human review and reporting of the kinds of things about accessibility that a human being really needs to analyze and determine that can't be determined just automatically. Another very recent development, again, this is also from the DAISY Consortium, is software called Word2EPUB. And this is something that you can either use online or you can download it and use it locally on your computer. But basically, it will automatically create an accessible EPUB3 from a properly structured Word file. Now, notice that I hope you heard that I italicized properly structured. Actually, that's called emphasis in HTML. And basically what that means is using word styles and using them the right way. Now, a lot of people resist that. That drives me crazy because I've used word styles literally for decades. All of my proposals and consulting reports, et cetera, use a styles library that I've created. And it just makes it so much easier to author content because you aren't futzing around with formatting and spacing. Oh, I need to make that thing bold. And oh, yeah, spacing is wrong. I need to make more space above that thing and blah, blah, blah. How did I do that subhead, etc. If you use styles properly, Word to EPUB will create an accessible EPUB. Even if you do a crummy job, it will still be better than a PDF typically for being accessible. And then finally, I'll mention Benetech's our Global Certified Accessible program, which actually certifies a publisher's workflow as being able, having demonstrated that they properly produce accessible publications. And by the way, this is something, it does cost something for a publisher to get this because it's a ton of work on Benetech's part to do this analysis. It actually involves coaching of the publishers to say, here's what you're doing wrong, here's here's how you can fix this, blah, blah, blah. But once they get it right, Benetech actually goes back and spot checks every year or even a couple times a year to make sure that that publisher's books coming out of that workflow continue to be done right. And they also, it's not the same certification, but they also designate vendors who have demonstrated the ability to do accessibility properly. The reason that they can't just say this vendor does it right is that the vendor is often dependent on what the publisher specs. And so sometimes I had an accessibility review for a publisher a few months ago where I knew the publisher well and I knew the vendor well, and I knew the vendor knew how to do good EPUBs and accessible EPUBs. And when I reviewed the EPUBs, the markup was ridiculously bad. I thought, what the heck is going on here? This vendor knows better than this. Well, it turns out that they were using what that publisher specified should be used like 8 or 9 years ago. The publisher never changed the spec. The vendor never changed the workflow. The publisher thought what they were getting was fine because the books looked okay. And so, the publisher said, oh my God, we've got to come up with a new spec. And I said, no. Let the vendor tell you what to do. Let the vendor get it right and tell you what's right, because you don't need to go to all that trouble. They already know how to do it right. So here we are up to the future. And did I just paint a rosy picture or what? Well, yeah, regular publications can be accessible from the start. And it's called Born Accessible. And there's some educational publishers. I mentioned Macmillan Learning, scholarly publishers. Kogan Page in the UK is one of the first to do this. Scholarly publishers, trade publishers. Anansi Press in Canada is the first Canadian publisher to get global certified accessible. So it is possible. What do we mean by born accessible? It means that the people with print disabilities should be able to get the same publication at the same cost from the same retailers or aggregators or libraries at the same time as everybody else. Doesn't that seem obvious? Imagine, a student in a college course waiting sometimes weeks to get the book that their classmates have had from the beginning. They're at a horrible disadvantage. This is just wrong. And it is no longer, that's no longer necessary. This is something that Betsy Bowman, who's the CEO of Benetech, coined the phrase because she was at a conference about publications being born digital. And she said, well, if they're born digital, they should be born accessible. So since we got Halloween coming up, I figured I'd end with a scary image here at the end. So is that all there is to it? Well, sorry, that's not all there is to it. What I've been focusing on is getting your publications to be accessible. What I would be remiss in omitting would be that the systems that you use, the systems you use to produce those publications, the systems that you use to disseminate them, and the systems that your users use to discover them, those systems need to be accessible too. But don't panic. You don't have to do all that. It's a group effort. The publishing ecosystem as a whole is just making really good progress on this. All the players in the whole workflow, from peer review systems all the way through hosting and ebook reading systems and retailers, et cetera, all that technology is inherently becoming more and more accessible. So everybody has a role to play. Yes, your staff has a role to play. Your authors, like those image description drafts, your service providers, which I've been stressing a lot, the system providers that provide the tools that you use, and the dissemination partners. Everybody in the supply chain has a role to play in getting this right. So thank you very much for your attention. This lists all those various resources that I mentioned and shows you where to get them. Thank you very much. And I think we've got a few minutes for some questions. So John, back to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Bill. This is great to hear from you on this. And I think it really does have profound ethical implications. I do want to mention that before we get to the questions, that tomorrow we've got a great slate for the third and last day of our conference. We'll have Randy Townsend making opening remarks, Josephine Ciortino and Yael Fitzpatrick talking about millennials and manipulation. Then Aaron Price and Danielle Gallian talking about ethics and unethical behavior. And we will close tomorrow with a great plenary by Elda Roeder, Vice President and Publisher of Penguin Classics. And I want to remind people that at 4 p.m. tomorrow, we will have a networking opportunity, an informal happy hour in my WebEx room. It will be a different link. And I know some of the audience may be frustrated that this conference isn't a little bit more interactive. It's one of the limitations of doing a virtual conference. But we're glad to have your questions, and we'll start with a really great question here. We've recently gotten some quotes for accessibility conversion from our ebooks and found the EPUB 3 rates fairly reasonable, but PDF would be prohibitively expensive. Am I understanding correctly that PDF isn't a desirable format and special treatment for EPUB 3 isn't even needed outside of proper HTML formatting, HTML5 formatting and inclusion of alt text? This is from our great Dustin Sullivan.
Go ahead. Pardon me?
No, go ahead. I was just saying this is from our great alumni, Dustin Sullivan.
Boy, and I guarantee you that was not a plant on my part. It's not a ringer in the audience. That is a fabulous question, and I've never heard it asked better. Yes, PDF, but a lot of people are under the mistaken impression that PDFs are accessible. Almost all PDFs are not accessible. PDFs can be made to be somewhat accessible. They can be made more accessible than they start out being, but it's a lot of work, which is why that cost was higher than making an EPUB accessible, whereas an EPUB, as I've stressed, is more inherently accessible. So yes, you have to do things right in the EPUB, but it's much easier to get an EPUB accessible than a PDF accessible. And it is now considered the standard proper form for interchanging accessible publications and documents is the EPUB.
Great, thank you very much. So we also have a question here. Big textbook publishers and trade houses have the financial resources to invest in accessibility compliance across their imprints. How can smaller and nonprofit presses have the same standards outside of hiring a consultant, of course, on a more modest budget and often with fewer staff?
Well, the big distinction for the smaller publisher is whether their production is done in-house or whether they outsource the production. If they outsource the production, it's very likely that they can find a provider, not just the giant prepress houses that require a huge volume of business, but that they can find a prepress provider that knows how to do this right. And it should not, in fact, break the bank, and it shouldn't require upfront investment in that case. If you do it internally, increasingly tools like Word, InDesign, Google Docs, et cetera, are getting much better at being able to provide accessibility. InDesign EPUBs, I've normally not recommended EPUB. EPUBs just created from InDesign, but the accessible EPUBs are getting better. That can be done as an export. Of course, you need to just structure your InDesign files properly. But there also are tools like Sigil, et cetera. There are freelancers that know how to do these things that can help you get them right. So even if you publish 3 or 4 books a year, you should be able to find that it can become affordable to get your books accessible. And again, that's thanks to the fact that the standards and file formats are now so broadly understood and so widely used. So it's not rocket science anymore.
Great. And I would like to acknowledge our dear friend and late departed colleague, Robin Seaman from Benetech, who I know you worked with closely in developing the accessible guide with BISG, and I provide that to my students. And
that's fantastic.
So we have another question here from the audience, and please, audience, feel free to submit a few more questions. So, Bill, do you know if MathML, or I'm not sure if she meant MathXML. No, MathML is supported yet on Kindle, and do you have an image fallback?
It is not yet on Kindle, but many reading systems are moving in the right direction to display MathML. One thing that's about to come out, I mean, imminently, I think within the next week or two from DAISY, are guidelines on how to embed the MathML in your EPUBs when you have to also provide the image so that at least it's there. It's done in what's called the details element, which I'm getting into the weeds there. But there's a way to embed the MathML so that assistive technology can get at it, even though you have to have the image in the file so that the reading system for a sighted user renders the image, not the MathML. But things are getting a lot better on that score. So do pay attention to that. This is a temporary situation that a lot of work is being done to correct it.
Great, thank you. Let's see, I did want to mention to the audience that all of these sessions are being recorded, and if people are missing them or missed part of them, they can watch the recordings after, which will be on the same platform. We will plan to put the videos eventually on YouTube, but right now they will exist on the same platform. And if you would like to have a copy of the slides of any of these presentations, feel free to send me an email or the presenter, in this case, Bill, but I'm happy to provide them with the presenter's permission. Let's see, we've got a couple more questions here. If I wanted to improve my organization's EPUB specifications, could I submit them to DAISY or Benetech for review?
Yes, you could. Benetech, I actually shouldn't speak for DAISY and Benetech in this case, because you're not asking them to actually analyze your files, you're asking them to analyze the specifications. So I don't want to go on the record publicly of saying that they will do that when I'm not sure, because both of them are overloaded with work. So I would not want them to get flooded with specs from people, although they're both mission-driven organizations. And so that I mean, obviously there are consultants out there like me. I'm not trying to ask for the business, but there are plenty of consultants that could review those specs for you. But and actually, I've stressed that increasingly vendors do know how to do it right. So maybe the place to start, depending on who you're using, who's going to get those specs, it could be that the vendor actually can review the specs and say, yeah, this makes sense, or here's what we think you should do it this way, not that way, etc. But if it's specs that's going to say a graphic designer or a freelancer that may not know that, it would be a good idea to get the specs reviewed. Yeah, DAISY Consortium has
to start reaching out to ask Benetech or DAISY if they might do it.
Certainly, you could reach out to them. I wanted to make one other comment, John, is that one of DAISY's activities is called inclusivepublishing.org, and if you go to inclusivepublishing.org, you can find that they have what's called a knowledge base that gives you all kinds of details and examples of how to get your EPUBs proper. So if you're unsure about something, you can look it up in the DAISY knowledge base, and very likely that'll give you your answer. And it's public and free. Yeah.
I wasn't familiar with that one. Okay, another question. Do you have recommendations for born accessible verification systems, since many of these automatic catches are not? Well,
the gold standard is that DAISY's ACE accessibility checker. But again, any automated system, there are things that cannot be that require a human being to review them to make sure they're done properly. The example I gave was it can tell that your images have alt text, but it can't tell if the alt text is any good. There are a number of things like that that require a human review. But for EPUBs, the ACE checker is good. For a website, there are lots of things out there. I'm trying to remember. One thing that's kind of built into Google and Chrome is called Site Improve. That uses a technology which I use all the time, and I'm blanking on the name. But yes, there are accessibility checking tools for websites and for HTML files that are commonly available. If you'll email me, I'll give you some suggestions of tools that you might want to explore. But for EPUBs, it's ACE.
Okay. Our next question is something that I've definitely run into myself as well. The indexing field is very frustrated with what happens to our indexes when they are published in ebooks. Most of the time, the indexes are static and do not link to anything. Sometimes the indexes are stripped in the ebooks. Amazon Create Space is notorious. Well, we know that. Even when you speak with a rep, they will tell you it's impossible. Do you have any ideas on how to get our indexes accessible? Great question.
Yes, and it is not impossible. This is something that I've been preaching this for 10 years. First of all, I presume that the questioner is talking about a back of the book index. And I want to point out that what a back of the book index does, assuming that it's not like a legal book that has all the sections and paragraphs numbered. If it is, then the index points to those numbers. But for most books, the index entries point to page numbers. And one fundamental accessibility requirement is to have page break markers in your EPUBs. Many vendors now do that standard. I used to work for, I shouldn't mention a specific vendor, but the vendor that I used to work with routinely does this, has been doing it for years, putting page break markers in their EPUBs. And that DAISY knowledge base will show you exactly what the syntax of a page break marker should be. If you know anything about HTML, it's typically what's called an empty element, and it's a span, and you just put it at the beginning. Well, you put it at the transition. In other words, between the last word on one page and the next page, and the syntax of that span identifies what page is starting there. And accessibility needs that anyway. again, because the students that are taking that course that are blind, or any reader that's blind, when the professor says, your assignment is read from page 53 to page 87 for the next class, or turn to page 72 for the chart that I'm going to talk about, they have to be able to turn to page 72. So they need to know it's called it's not the page in a paginating EPUB, a paginating ebook. It's the print equivalent page number. And that's what the index references. So absolutely, and I mentioned I did an EPUB review for a scholarly publisher recently. This is Scholarly Monographs I'm talking about. One of the big scholarly publishers. And sure enough, both of them, they use two vendors, both of them very good vendors, and they were appropriately linking the page numbers in the indexes to those page break markers. And people, I work a lot in the tech side of the business, and the techies think page numbers. Why you want page numbers? That's a print artifact. Well, the reality is that today you want page numbers because the index refers to page numbers. Cross-references refer to page numbers. Reviewers cite things with page numbers in their reviews, etc. The reality is you still need page numbers because you still have print versions of books, and they're often the dominant version of the book. So it is absolutely possible to do that, and it is not difficult, and there are vendors that routinely do that. But you're absolutely right. It's very frustrating because usually it's not done. And they will tell you it can't be done, which is not true.
Right. Well, thank you, Bill. Thank you. This is really important work, and I'm really heartened to see so much progress in accessibility, and I love the term born accessible. So thank you again for joining us, and all the attendees, thank you for listening, and we'll see you tomorrow. And please also come to our networking opportunity to end the conference. Thanks again.
Thanks a lot.